So, all right. So this will be a little odd for me because I don't get to see any of you guys. I just get to look at my PowerPoint. So feel free to jump in if you have questions, but I won't be able to see you raise your hand or anything. So just speak up. So just a couple quick housekeeping items. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to try my best to leave some time at the end for questions. One thing to be aware of when we start talking about technology, it is such a big, broad subject, and it's just barely starting to be talked about and coming to the awareness. So what we're going to talk about today is really just scratching the surface, and it's going to be very broad strokes of what's out there, but I will make sure to send you guys my email. It'll be at the end of the presentation, and Jenny and I can make sure to get that to you as well. So if you have questions afterwards, let me know. I did put in here, please mute yourself, but if you do have questions, feel free to throw them up. And then please just exercise patience. You guys may have seen my light just come out a little bit, maybe if my screen's not being shared. So just because we're doing this over technology, please just be patient if we have any hiccups. All right, let's talk about your brain and technology. So first and foremost, we'll kind of just do a broad overview. So I like this image because it kind of talks about how a lot of screen-related factors can trigger stress for our brains. One thing to be aware of is that our brains have evolved for many, many, many years to be living in nature. So things like air, breeze, wind, trees, water. Our brain doesn't have to put work into thinking about what is this thing, is it safe, is it not safe, because that's where we've lived for so many years. We've evolved a lot faster than our brains can really keep up with. So today we live and work in spaces that have fluorescent lighting, that have a lot of screens, that tend to have a lot of colors and things that are not usually found in nature. So our brains are kind of chronically doing work to understand and tune out a lot of that. So the fluorescent lights usually have a very low buzzing hum that most people don't notice unless you stop and actually listen to that. But that means there's a part of your brain that's kind of constantly working to understand what that is. And when we think about screens and technology, that's usually like one of the newest areas for our brains to kind of understand. Jenny Jo, I see a raised hand. Is there a question?
Yes, I apologize for pausing you, but we're having a really hard time reading. The slides are extremely blurry.
Oh, weird. Okay.
I know, I don't know why that is. But I was wondering if it's blurry on your end.
Brenda?
It's actually showing up perfectly clear, so I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. Let me stop and try sharing one more time and see if it would be easier that way.
And Brenda, you might, while you're showing your PowerPoint, you might turn your video off because it might be a broadband thing. I've run into that.
Okay. Let's see.
Okay.
And I'm here.
Looks good.
So let's, that's it.
Is that it? Or you guys seeing a little bit better?
Yeah, and we can all just keep our video off for the presentation and then put it back on at the end.
Okay, cool. So is that showing up a little bit better for everybody?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. That's those technology hiccups we got to be patient, work through, huh? Okay. So yeah. So one thing I really learned about Restart is that typically a lot of the time we spend in front of screens, our brains, and we're not often aware of it or might not feel like it, but they tend to be in states of hyperarousal. Most people are aware of this as fight or flight. So we see a lot of engagement with the reward and addiction pathways of the brain. One of the cleanest examples of this is when you get a text message. Your phone usually buzzes or makes some sort of ding. So at that point, you're actually getting some sensory stimulation because you see it, you hear it, and there's usually some sort of touch or vibration if it's in your pocket. Very few things in nature are going to trigger those three things all at once. So then you have this flash of usually dopamine and some other brain chemicals that go, ooh, what is that? Because you don't know if it's like, you know, a notification from your shopping app, or if it's your friend texting you, or if it's work. So then you get excited to go look at it. And most people don't wait to look at a text message. So you just look at it, but then that rewards that behavior. And then it creates that kind of addiction pathway for, I have to look at a text message right now. This, when we look at what is most similar, it's like when you are sitting at a slot machine and you push the button to get the slot machine started and you don't know what your result's going to be. If we go back to the idea that a lot of technology is very new for our brains to understand, one area that we see this a lot is the bright and blue toned light. Most people are familiar with this when it comes to the idea of sleeping and going to sleep at night. But the truth is this is going to happen all throughout your day. It's just harder at night. But there are very few things in nature that have a bright and blue toned light because sunlight is in tones of warm colors, reds, oranges, yellows. So again, your brain is kind of having to do this little process of working to understand that that's just kind of normal and natural. You also see a lot of this media multitasking and that interactivity. So if we go back to the example of a text message, if I'm in the middle of like doing an email or something, but then I get a text message, I'll usually stop, I'll read the email, and then I'll go right back to the text. And I'm just like, I'll flip back and forth through all of that. But what you find is there's a lot of media multitasking, because think about how many times have you been doing an email, you have other tabs open, you do text messages, and then maybe somebody like calls you. So there you're already bouncing back and forth a lot. And that just feeds into your brain, goes, okay, well, if you're being really interactive and you're rapidly going through these things, then that probably means I need to be in a state of hyperarousal just to match what's going on and work with you on it. There is some elements of the electromagnetic radiation that you naturally just get from technology, phones, computers, tablets, but I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about it, so I can't speak to it as much as I can these other factors. Some other things that I learned about when I was at Restart is that there's some pretty decent developmental impacts that happen when screen time and children get paired together, including some actual physical structural changes that you can see within the brain. So one example of this would be a phenomenon that's starting to be called acquired autism. So what this looks like is a young child, usually 1 to 3, is showing some textbook symptoms of autism. They can't make eye contact, they're rigid and fixated, they've got some very strong mood swings, temper tantrums, things like that. So then when you dig into it, what is usually found is that a majority of these children have spent a good portion of their developmental years being given a screen. And this isn't to say it's like parents' fault. Sometimes parents just don't know. But because of that, these children have never gotten the face-to-face contact that's important for healthy babies to develop. They often don't get as much social interaction, either with peers or siblings or things like that. And because of these hyperarousal features, they have a very hard time regulating their emotions because their brains really only know how to be in fight or flight. And the reason it's called acquired autism is because when you take the screens away and insert ways for them to developmentally appropriately move forward through those different phases, the quote unquote autism goes away. And this is a really new phenomenon that they're starting to see. But they'll notice that places in the brain, especially when it comes to like empathy and the ability to read nonverbal signals, actually get smaller. So when it comes to children and any developing brains, being very mindful of technology can be highly important from a brain aspect. So that kind of goes into this idea of when you spend a lot of time in front of a screen, you tend to have a lowered ability to read nonverbal communication because that part of your brain is generally just not being asked to be used. Now, I've had conversations back and forth with a lot of the kids I've worked with where they go, well, but when I'm playing my video game, I have my headset on. So I'm actually talking to kids and I hear their tone of voice. I'm, chatting with people through these different video platforms. So I'm seeing their faces. So isn't that giving me that opportunity to do nonverbals? To some extent, yes. And it is better than just straight screen time. However, there's a couple things that are going on. There's things in your brain called mirror neurons that mirror what another person is doing that are kind of constantly working. That's why we say things like monkey see, monkey do, because that's an actual thing. When we're on Zoom, I don't care how fast your internet, how good your computer is, there's a tiny little bit of a lag. So therefore, your mirror neurons in your brain literally can't keep up with what it's seen with the other person, like it can when you're face to face in person. So it helps, but it's not the best. And what a lot of research is showing is that empathy and compassion and the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is built on the ability to read nonverbal communication. The other thing to think about is that nonverbals include your entire body. And most of the time when we're doing screen stuff, even if it is over Zoom, it's from a face up kind of standpoint. So those were definitely things I saw quite a bit. Another big challenge that I dealt with in working with a lot of the youth that I did was that, and it goes back to that media multitasking and that interactivity, everything was so fast and so at their fingertips that they had no tolerance for boredom, no tolerance to be told no, and they were extremely used to the instant gratification of getting their answer met, of figuring out the information. So for example, at our center, we had a mated pair of bald eagles on property, and we were kind of farther set across from the river, but you could watch them with binoculars, and the kids would have so many questions about the eagles. We also had a whole set of encyclopedias because they were not allowed any screen time when they were at our residential center. So I would redirect them to like, hey, well, why don't you go read up on eagles in the encyclopedia? Almost none of them did because they didn't have the tolerance to go and read the information. They were so used to just, hey, Google, what's this? Hey, Siri, what's this? And just that instant gratification for getting their information right away. The other thing, and again, it's kind of, we talked briefly about it with the reward addiction pathways. The two primary chemicals that you see in the brain putting to work for those reward addiction pathways are dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine is generally thought of as kind of the happy chemical. And another way to think about it is it's the novelty seeking chemical. So what is new? In that text message example, dopamine is going to kick in when it goes, ooh, who is texting me? What is this text about? Serotonin is a similar one where it has a lot to do with mood regulation and memory. So what I would see with a lot of the youth that were coming through our residential center was that they had spent so much time in front of a screen, and the closest comparison would be like, somebody who struggles with alcoholism, drinking and drinking and drinking. So their tolerance to their preferred drug was so high that nothing seemed to really be fun anymore for these kids. And when I first started working with Restart, I truly didn't believe in a tech detox because I was picturing when we think of a detox from a chemical substance, which can be serious and really intense. But the truth is, I watched every single kid living at a residential center go through a detox period. But what it looked like is the chemicals in their brain that were so used to being flooded in these really high amounts finally got a chance to kind of level back out. And things that didn't become really exciting when they first moved in, like the beautiful nature that was all around them, these like giant slugs that all the boys were interested in. At about the 30 to 45 day mark, when the brain's chemicals were finally able to come back to more baseline and normal levels, those things all of a sudden became really exciting because they actually produced dopamine and serotonin for the kids in a way that they hadn't been able to before. So that's kind of a really brief overview of a lot of the factors that I saw with somebody's brain when we thought about technology. And we're going to talk about these in some very large kind of areas of the internet and how they kind of show up differently in those areas. But the other really big thing that I valued about my time at Restart was getting a solid backing about the systems themselves and how they're built and how they're made. So I found this really nice example of Facebook, because most people use Facebook, so they're pretty aware and understand this model. But when we think of how Facebook was made, Facebook pulled, and most tech companies are doing this these days, they pulled from two what they call core drives. So the first is a black core drive, and black core drives can be thought of as somebody is going to use our system and our platform because of a negative feature. So I'm obsessed with it. I have anxiety if I'm not using it. I'm pretty addicted to it. So in the case of Facebook, that's kind of these three down here with scarcity, avoidance, and unpredictability. So like if I don't use Facebook, it's kind of that scarlet letter piece. And so therefore it drives me to do it because I get anxious if I don't. Unpredictability is one of the like hardest, coolest ones to look at from like a brain science piece, because think about refreshing content. That's that scrolling thing we do. That did not always used to be a feature in most social media platforms, but what Facebook did is they tried like a smaller beta group and they said, okay, what if we change how we show content so that you scroll up and the content is constantly refreshing for you? What they found out of that beta group is that people's eyeballs spent way more time on the screen because they didn't know what the next piece of content was going to be. And there's this kind of thought process of like, the next thing's always going to be better. So what is that next better thing? And that's why you now see just about every single social media, most websites, things like that on the internet in that form where you use your Facebook and your smartphone to scroll and always be finding that refreshing content. The other half of this is what they call white core drives, which are considered kind of driven to use the platform from feelings of power, fulfillment, satisfaction. So in the case of Facebook, that's those three up here, where, you know, I feel really accomplished when I'm getting a lot of likes and contents. I'm getting a lot of friends when I'm here on Facebook. I feel meaning because I stay in touch with my friends. I think that's a really common one that we hear from a lot of people when we think about using Facebook. I use Facebook because I get the instant feedback when people like my videos, when people like my posts and my pictures. That makes me feel empowered and good. There's also these two here of ownership and social pressure that kind of pull a little bit from both black and white core drives. So in the case of ownership, you know, it's this is my Facebook. Like, this is all my information. These are my photos and friends. And then, you know, the social pressure of like, well, if I don't, or, you know, maybe I do it because I want to see what other people are doing. I'm kind of stalking them a little bit. So again, each one of these slides we could spend a ton of time on, but I found it super valuable when I was thinking about how to be mindful of my tech use and make sure it's tech use that's sustainable for my life, in knowing that these systems exist and these platforms are built around models like this. And by and large, what you got to remember is that these companies are in it for money. They're a company and they are so big at this point. Like, I think the last count I had heard is if Facebook was a country, it would be one of the larger countries in the world just based on how many people are using it. So these companies do not see you as a person. All they can see you as is a data point because they have too many people using them. So because of that, they're going to craft the entire system in a way that more data points are functioning in a way to make them more money. And most companies do this through various different ad revenue. Like most people are aware, Facebook will show you ads all the time. And that just goes back to the more ads they can show you, the more money that they can make as a company. So that's just a little piece of kind of the back end of the system. So this next bit is we'll go into 6 kind of really broad swaths and areas of different ways people can use technology on the internet. So this first one we'll talk about is using technology for fun. So some examples would include video games, playing puzzles, mobile games like games you play on your phone. So this picture here is a picture of esports. I don't remember exactly where it came from, but this is a very real, very live thing. There's about 8 people, 10 people down here playing video games, and these screens are being showed to their thousands of watching audience members. So esports, or like electronic gaming, is becoming one of the biggest growing markets. It's starting to be shown on like ESPN, things like that. So remember how we said it's all about money? Well, the count I was able to come up with is that the global gaming market by 2025 is going to be making about $250 billion. Because gaming is just huge, and it's part of our society and becoming much more part of our society these days. And again, everything in moderation. Definitely not bad to play video games, but what video games are going to do to your brain is a little bit different. So one of the biggest challenges that I heard when I was working for Restart, and I continue to hear between kids and parents, is the parents say, hey, it's time for dinner, pause your game, come to dinner. And the kid goes, my game can't pause. And the parent goes, what do you mean? Like, I remember Mario and these, Nintendo games. You could pause them and come back to them later. What's happened is a lot of these games like Fortnite, Minecraft, Call of Duty, things like that, they've created what they call open world models. And in a lot of respects, they've modeled it after a casino where it's incredibly immersive. There's a lot of sensory stimulation, lights, colors, sounds. There's no easy ability to see time, no clocks, no, you have to put some effort in to know how much time you have spent in that environment. And they don't pause. There's literally no ability to just pause the game. And that was a specific thing most gaming companies did because they wanted to make the games more immersive, more engaging. And what they found is when you removed the ability to stop the game in any way, shape, or form, people spent more hours in the game. The fight or flight brain is huge during a lot of gameplay. Anything from like Sims all the way up to like, first person shooter kind of games, because most of these games are designed in certain ways that it's that very fast interactivity, rapid pace. And especially for certain styles of games, you are literally in like fight or flight situations. So when you think about games that are modeled after various like war or army scenarios, you're literally a soldier and you're trying to go through these different worlds and hunt down bad guys. So how is your brain not supposed to be in a fight or flight mode? But again, when you're doing that a lot, that's the system that your brain almost can get kind of stuck in. The other pieces that we see a lot of is that there's a lot of like social modeling and social pressures that are coming out of video games. And I'm seeing this a lot more with like younger kids I'm working with, where they want to play Among Us, which is a game, but in real life. So they'll literally like recreate this internet game with themselves on the playground. And if a kid doesn't know about Among Us or how to play it, they have a really hard time being included with the rest of the kids. So there you're getting this social pressure of, I actually need to play this game so I can understand what people are talking about so I can play with my kids. And that's kind of happening all throughout. I just see it more with youth because those are a lot of the populations I work with. But like young adult males is another population that's getting a lot of social pressures when it comes to tech as fun. Another thing that we saw really common is pretty hypersexualized characters in most video games. And this is across the board with genders. So men tend to be these big, manly, strong, kind of men. Women tend to be very scantily clad. There's a lot of comments and, different chat platforms for these video games that is literally about which video game character has a bigger butt and better boobs and things like that. But it's the video game companies don't necessarily, they're just trying to make characters that look cool, but there's this thing that'll happen where then that becomes the model of what's a good person to look like. And you're never going to look like a video game character. It's just not going to happen. But it is something to kind of just be aware of. There's also that really big element of FOMO, or fear of missing out. So that goes back to a little bit of that social pressure, but this is a huge driving factor, especially for a lot of these games that are doing events and like one-time deals that you can only get. Like Fortnite is really chronic for this, where they have seasons where people will play for a little bit of time and then the season goes away and there's a new season, and each new season tends to have some sort of theme to it. So if you don't take part in that season, then you're missing out on all these opportunities to get these cool prizes and costumes and pets and things like that. So there's this real driving factor of FOMO, of like, I have to do this because if I don't, I'm going to miss out on it. And because your brain tends to be in these states of hyperarousal and fight or flight, that can feel really big and really important for somebody, unless they're not necessarily balancing that with other things in their life, so that they can step back and go, not actually missing out, it's a game. And it doesn't have to feel that important, but it's still there. The other element that I saw with a lot of the kids we worked with was that they were using video games or mobile games as a way to escape from quote unquote IRL, or in real life. So whatever was happening in their off life settings, maybe they were getting a lot of fights with parents or siblings, or school wasn't going so well. Instead of learning tools to handle that and sit with that distress and work through it, they would instead set it aside, put headphones on, turn their phone on, whatever it is, and just escape for a little while. So to some extent, this isn't necessarily a bad coping mechanism, but it becomes a problem when the brain doesn't learn how to deal with states of discomfort, because there's a lot of times you're going to feel discomforted in your life. And if you don't know really how to deal with it, and the only tool you do know how to use is to run away to technology, which comes with its own host of revisiting those reward and addiction pathways, that's where it can become pretty problematic. Another area that gets a lot of attention is tech as socializing. So examples would be like various different social media platforms, TikTok, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram. Memes can kind of fit under this, blogs, trolling, self-help groups, YouTube, when you think about the comment section. So what you see when we kind of look at this corner of the internet is a fair amount of like self-image challenges. Most people are fairly aware of that. You know, that's why I added kind of this funny picture of like Instagram's so perfect, but real life's kind of not. And we do kind of laugh about it, but at the same time, it is pretty real challenges, especially for a lot of like adolescents that are just starting to create their self-image. So that is something that becomes very present when you spend a lot of time in those states of hyperarousal on social media, and you're already having some struggles with your self-image. It can feed into it a lot. The flip side to this is that what we see is that social media for some people can allow a lot of exploration of self. So for people who maybe are questioning gender identity or cultural pieces, there's a lot that can be done through social media to help explore who that self is. We definitely see a lot of FOMO with social media, but it might look kind of different. Not like I'm missing out on this event, but like I see pictures from my friend's birthday party that I wasn't invited to. So therefore I'm feeling FOMO, and then I get anxious because like, well, why did this person not invite me? Why did this person not talk to me about it? And yet I'm seeing all of these pictures about this event I wasn't invited to. There's also like a fear of missing out if somebody is not partaking in a various social media platforms. So I had one youth I was working with who had their streak going on Snapchat, meaning they were talking back and forth with other people for a certain period of time. I think it was like a year and a half or 2 years. And he was so interested in keeping his streak going that even though he was in tech rehab, he gave his sibling his phone and he said, you need to keep my streak going. And that was the anxiety of FOMO. If he didn't, he wouldn't be able to socially keep up with as many of his friends because he had missed out on the ability to maintain his streak for a multiple series of years. One of the other things we see when we think about tech as socialization is a lot of really big groupthink patterns and cognitive biases. And there's a ton of different cognitive biases out there, so I'm not going to go into every single one. But an example would be like a negativity bias, meaning your brain is geared to find what's wrong before it will find what's right. And when we think about social media, our brains are going to feed into this hard, especially if we're already in those states of hyperarousal, unless we can stop and mindfully ask ourselves, well, maybe what is some of the good in this? Or, how is the silver lining present in this thing? So that's in some respects why we see people having such a hard time with various different social media platforms and things like that, or why things like the phenomena that they're calling doom scrolling, where you just continue to look through and then feel really bad because everything you're seeing is pretty negative. Groupthink patterns are also really big because you end up in these kind of echo chambers of people who think and act and behave the same way that you do, so you don't end up getting that human to human feedback that you might in person of, hey, that thing you said is actually not very okay. Because if everybody's telling you it's okay, then your brain starts to create these patterns that say that is okay. These are being talked about a fair amount more since the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, because it's kind of come alive that these things can translate to real life. They can translate pretty good to real life stuff, but they're based on these echo chambers of groupthink patterns. Another huge area that we see is tech as information. So examples would include things like Wikipedia, reading news a lot, watching YouTube, doing TED Talks. What we had kind of coined as Restart as info junkies. So we treated a fair amount of youth who actually really didn't play video games or use social media very much. However, they were still engaging in a lot of problematic use because they were using the internet to literally just saturate themselves with information. So when you go to a Wikipedia page to find out about something, there's usually a section at the bottom that says references, and you can go there and you can continue learning about the thing that you wanted to learn about. They would do that, but they would do that for hours and go down the rabbit hole of learning about something. Dark web is also somewhere that you kind of see tech as information, and some people have heard about it, but a lot of people may not be fully aware of it. And again, we could spend all day talking about the dark web, but pretty much this picture illuminates it pretty well if we think of the iceberg as the internet. So the top part is what we see, and that's what's called surface web. And it's honestly pretty small. It's only like 10 or less % of the internet. And it's what's considered indexed internet, pretty much meaning if I put a post on Facebook or a YouTube comment that's like, I'm going to go and shoot my neighbor in his sleep because his dog's super loud. Because everything on there becomes indexed and filed away in a pretty easy system, law enforcement could go to YouTube and they could say, hey, where's this comment? We need to trace it back to this person, and it can pretty easily be done. However, that's not most of the internet. Deep web is this kind of in-between section that makes up about 90-ish% of the internet, and it's considered unindexed internet. So for example, if I go to somebody's blog post and I comment in their blog post, man, my neighbor's dog's so annoying, I'm going to go shoot my neighbor, that cannot necessarily be traced very easily because that's not indexed internet. That's just internet that's out there. For people who, have gone through school and they've used various academic platforms to find research articles, that lives in the deep web. So the deep web is most of the internet. And then the dark web or the dark net they really truly don't know how big it is, which is why the iceberg becomes a pretty good metaphor for thinking about it. But the dark web is where they maintain a lot of hidden services. So a few years back, the FBI finally did catch the ringleader for what they were calling the Silk Road. And the Silk Road was essentially like an eBay for the dark web, but the things that were being sold was like child pornography and human organs and murder for hire services and revenge death porn. So like some pretty nasty stuff can live on the dark web that doesn't ever really filter up to the deeper surface web. And the hidden services is because there's usually multiple layers of encryption. So you can think about this as like there would be a direct line when you use Facebook to you. In the deep web, there could be a direct line with maybe a couple breaks to you. When you get down to the dark web, it can be really hard to find somebody because it's like playing telephone, and it's like person to another IP address to another place to over here, and that happens worldwide. So by the time you're trying to find this person who maybe bought something from the Silk Road, it's really hard. The other thing that we see happen a lot in the dark web is people tend to pay for stuff in cryptocurrency, which is like online cash. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But essentially, that is an important element of the internet. I always like to make sure people are kind of aware of, not to scare you, but just to know that that's out there. And when we think about brains and the internet and technology, this is a part of it, because if people are spending a lot of time down here, what we see is that there's usually can be anxiety provoking for some. There's some of this FOMO, but not because you're accessing the dark web, but because maybe you're missing out on important information that's happening all throughout the internet. It can be anxiety provoking to be on the dark web because it's like you're buying from the black market and stuff. So that, depending on who you are as a person, can be kind of sketchy and scary, but you're just sitting here scrolling your phone. So somebody doesn't know if you're just doing Facebook or if you're all the way down here on the dark web. When we think about tech as information, we also still continue to see some of those cognitive biases, things like illusory superiority, pretty much just saying, well, I have some information, so I know it all, or I am better than somebody else because I have some bits and pieces of information. Now, the problem is this usually happens in some amount of limited context. So if I've watched like one TED Talk about something, then I might start to say, well, I know a lot about this topic or this thing, but there's limited context for how that piece of information can necessarily fit into the larger picture of both online and offline life. I also added hacking in here because some aspects of hacking are really more for information gathering purposes than they are anything else. So those were some things that we saw when we were treating tech as information. There's also the element, and we kind of touched a little bit of this, of like using tech for work. So I found this kind of funny meme because I think some people feel like when the Wi-Fi isn't working, we've gone way back to the caveman ages. But the truth is, Wi-Fi is a really, really new thing for us. But because it has made work so connected, so easy in some respects, and productivity can become so much higher, Wi-Fi and connection to the internet, when we think about work, has become vital, just completely vital. And especially in this last year with the pandemic. So some examples would include things like LinkedIn, email, productivity apps, even things like various different workout platforms. Like I know Peloton has a pretty large social media workout videos type piece to it. So it's not necessarily work that you're getting money for, but it's work in the sense that you're still putting the same amount of energy and effort in. I didn't see this as much with the youth I worked with, but I definitely saw it with a lot of their parents. You know, for example, one of the kids I worked with had a very interesting interaction with a parent because they were talking about limiting his tech use, but he turned to his parent and he said, but you are always on your phone. And that parent went, yeah, because I'm a teacher and that's what I'm being asked to do for work right now. But they had never had that conversation. So the kid just assumed their parent was like doing the same things that they were, scrolling through social media and things like that. When the parent was like, I actually wish I could use like technology, but this is what's being asked from my job. So that became an interesting interaction to kind of work through and start to kind of raise the question of productivity as equaling personal worth. And again, the brain tends to create a lot of these patterns. So one phrase I've heard for it is this idea of internalized capitalism. Capitalism being the idea of work, work, work some more, and that your worth is tied to how much productivity you can have. The reason it becomes internalized is it's not necessarily somebody outside you telling you these things. It's your own brain and your own self-talk and your own patterns that start to then tell you, well, if you're not doing this, then you're bad, or man, you didn't put in a bunch of hours at work today, like what's wrong with you? So what we see is that there becomes these really big challenges at actually disconnecting from work and not being constantly present with work, especially with things like various productivity apps that can live with you all the time and make it much harder to do that work-life balance. Now, the pandemic, I think, has been interesting because it has definitely brought more of this to light and allowed it to become more of a conversation. And it has also increased these challenges of disconnecting. FOMO is completely present when we think about tech as work, because people will get feedback. Oh man, you weren't at this meeting. Why not? Well, because the meeting was like 8 o'clock at night. That's after my work hours, guys. But then there's FOMO. Like, what am I missing because I'm not constantly present and connected to work? Tech is money is another really big factor. So examples would be gaming, but not necessarily gaming for fun, like gaming to make money. So that picture I showed you of esports, each one of those people playing was probably making thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars just being present at that event. Gambling that happens on the internet, loot boxes are something that happens in gaming where it's basically gambling. You pay money, you get a random box. You don't know what your random box is going to have in it. It might be new costumes, new pets, new weapons or armor. Things like stocks, shopping, cryptocurrency, and hacking, but hacking in the respect of it's usually looking like ransomware. Like, I have this piece of information and you can have it, but you have to give me money first. This is, again, it's present, but it's less present than maybe some of the other areas, but it's there. So what we see on a brain level is there tends to be financial anxiety can be a big one because you're so constantly tied in. It's this one down here, FOMO, and you get fixated on the dollar. So if you cannot always be part of it and getting that information, you tend to have some financial anxiety. Financial strain is also something that I saw very frequently in a lot of the families I worked with because their kids were so smart. They learned all these workarounds to basically take money out of mom and dad's electronic accounts and then use them for video games, for buying things, for whatever it is that they wanted. But it was creating a large amount of strain among the family because their parents were like, well, where's all my money going? I don't know how to trace this. I don't know what's happening. So an example of this that uses kind of like micro transactions, which are the very small purchases you can do online, is I had a kiddo who was playing Clash of Clans, which is an online mobile game that you can, like, the way the game will work is it'll be like, well, you could spend this much time. So this goes back to that instant gratification boredom piece. You could take the time and the effort to build up all of your resources to make this castle to then have your army to then be better. Or you can pay us like 99 cents and we'll give you a pile of this resource. And maybe you could give us $5 and we'll give you a box that has a bunch more of these resources. So essentially, instead of just being patient and spending the time and putting the work in, you can do the micro transactions that seem pretty small, like, oh, it's only 99 cents here. Oh, it's only a couple dollars here. The problem is most of us are probably aware, that adds up so fast. We have a good friend who is now up to 6 figures in Clash of Clans, and he's held the #1 spot for about a year, but that's also because of the amount of money he's putting into it. So tech as money is definitely a pretty present part of it. And then the last area of the internet that we see coming to life is tech as like lust. I'm not even going to call it love, even though that is definitely something that can happen online. I almost never saw it. I treated a large amount of pornography addictions with a majority of the youth I worked with. So pornography is a giant part of this. Dating sites and apps are big ones, and some social media platforms, depending on what they are really geared more towards this idea of finding romantic partners. So what I would see in a lot of the kids I worked with, because they were using porn as their model for relationships and sex, you would get this really kind of skewed image of sex and relationships, and their self-image would tend to be less as a result. So there was an interesting study that they did with a number of college kids who were in more long-term committed romantic relationships, and they interviewed each part of the couple separately. And these were mostly male-female couples. But what they were finding was that, by and large, a lot of the women were reporting that they weren't feeling like they were becoming pleasurable to their partner because they couldn't have sex as long as maybe they were supposed to. They weren't able to do all of these kind of like crazy positions and things like that. And that they didn't feel like their bodies matched the bodies that they were seeing in the internet. Men would report a lot of the same things. They didn't feel like they were able to maintain healthy sex for very long. They didn't feel like they looked the way they should look, and they didn't feel like they were pleasuring their partner in a way that they wanted to. Now, when they asked most of these couples, well, where are you getting this model? They said, well, porn. And then when they sat them down together and they said, well, share with each other, they went, I actually think we're having pretty good sex, but we're modeling this against something that we can't really match. So one example, or like a metaphor that I heard, is you can think of like when you watch an action movie, you can enjoy it. You can get into it. Like when I'm watching Transformers, I'll enjoy it. But I don't walk down the street thinking this car is going to become some crazy big robot thing. It just, I know that it's a movie and it's exaggerated, and that's why it can be entertaining. Porn can be very similar. It's like the action movie for sex, but it doesn't create a good model for day-to-day healthy relationship patterns. So that's kind of that poor ability to practice the healthy relationship patterns, and seeing generally pretty low empathy, because unfortunately, when you're using porn or potentially even some dating sites and things as models for what is a healthy relationship, it doesn't leave room for compassion, empathy, courtship, dating. It tends to just be meat and sex. And that whole middle piece is very clearly kind of getting left out of the conversation. And as a society, it's starting to kind of go away. So where this gets to be a problem is that, especially for young and developing brains who are learning about sex, they don't get good models to work off of. So instead, there's this hypersexualization from things like video games, social media, porn, things like that. The other thing that we're starting to see a lot more of is pretty rigid gender stereotypes getting reinforced, much more with men than with women. But with men, you're seeing kind of this area of the internet that's starting to push ideas of an alpha male. So alpha beta males is what they're kind of talking about them. And, you know, like we think of an alpha male, it's somebody big, strong, gets their needs met, has sex whenever they want. That's what's kind of being modeled as the alpha male. We're also seeing what they're starting to call incels, or primarily frustrated young adult men who are feeling like, I deserve a woman. I deserve sex, and it's the woman's fault that I'm not getting this. So the Parkland shooter down in Florida is an example of this, because when they dug into his online internet, what they found is that he had been part of some of these different websites and social media platforms and things that encourage that groupthink context, that echo chamber of a bunch of young men saying, well, you deserve this from a woman. And he had been rejected by one of his classmates when he had asked her out. So because he didn't have a good way to sit with the rejection, because he wasn't receiving a lot of the support he should have probably been receiving, and because he was sitting in these echo chambers of saying it's okay to be violent for a woman when she's not giving you what you need, he therefore was then maybe felt justified in going and creating this act of violence towards others. So that was just kind of a little bit of what I often would see in a lot of the kids I worked with when we think about technology and sex. So I really enjoy this quote from Tom Clancy, because that can be like a scary way to think about technology. But the truth is, technology by and large is really just a tool. It's how we as individual humans, as families, as cultures and communities and societies choose to use it, that's going to determine the risk or benefit. There can be a lot of awesome things that come out of technology. There can be a lot of really bad things that come out of technology. So just being mindful about why are you using it at this point in time? What is the purpose of it? And how can it go south can really just kind of help us use technology in ways that can be wise, mindful, and sustainable. So there's my email, bstephani@lespreemt.com. I'll put it in our chat box too. So I'm thinking we're pretty much at time. My phone's telling me I have 2 minutes left, but I would be happy to stay on and answer some questions if anybody has them.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Brenda. That was amazing.
You're welcome.
My brain is just an overload. That was a lot.
Like I said, this is just scratching the surface. We could do like day-long trainings for you guys on all this if you really want.
Yes. Are there any questions? You were so thorough. I don't have any questions. Does anybody else have questions?
Yes, thank you, Heidi. Involuntary celibates. Exactly. I'm just reading the comments now.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, the kids at our QSA told me about incels. I didn't know. They teach me all kinds of stuff.
They do. I mean, the kids know about it. There's a phenomena of like internet digital natives versus digital immigrants.
Yep.
And that definitely comes alive when we think about youth, because they understand technology far better than most.
Oh, yeah.
But it's their lives, you know?
Yeah. It is really interesting. And I'll refer to them as digital natives sometimes. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm not native. And I'm like, no, digital. All right, let's see. I don't see. All right. Well, no questions. Thanks, everybody. And Brenda has her email there, so reach out to her if questions come later on. I'm sure that she'd be happy to answer. Thank you so much, Brenda.
No problem. Thank you guys
Brenda.
so much for letting me do this.
Yeah, it was great. And it was actually really perfect for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, this month of April. We're talking about how the internet could be a tool, and it could also be something devastating. So thank you so much.
No problem. I hope you all have a great weekend.
You too. Bye, guys.
Bye.